The first thing you need to make pho is a good quality broth. So this is pork broth, and it's got a little bit of salt and some spices added to it. From a previous video I showed you how to make broth, and what I'm going to do now is turn that up to high heat. I'm going to add dehydrated shiitake mushrooms. These dehydrated shiitake mushrooms are so much more convenient and cheaper than store-bought fresh shiitake. You can get them in the Asian market. And what I'm going to do is bring this up to a nice boil, and I'm going to throw in about that many shiitake mushrooms and let them rehydrate. The next step, while the mushrooms are rehydrating, is to process all of the stuff I picked out of the garden today. So these are some onions, mostly green onions used for the stems. I got some chard, some Swiss chard. I got some little red ones and some green ones. Got a little bit of kale. Now this is anise basil. It kind of has a licorice flavor to it. And of course I've got tons of cilantro. This is actually going to flour, but I use the whole thing. The stalks, the stems, the flowers, everything. So I'm gonna wash these up and chop them up. I'm also going to use the tops of the onions that are almost going to flour as a decorative feature for my pho. Alright, the shiitakes have had time to rehydrate. I'm going to take those out of the broth, and then I'm going to add in a lot of the herbs and a lot of the flavoring and just let that broth continue to simmer while I finish preparing the ingredients. Alright, one of the things that really makes pho stand out is to use vinegar or acidity. This is my homemade pepper sauce. It's cayenne peppers that I grew in just white vinegar, and I don't take any measurements. Just going to pour in, I'd say maybe about a quarter cup, maybe a half a cup, and then to buffer that acidity, just a little bit of sugar. I'd say maybe about a tablespoon. Another key ingredient in my pho is cilantro. This is fresh cilantro from the garden, and it's already gone to seed and flower, and what I'm doing is just chopping that whole stem and leaf and flower up, and I'm going to use about this much to flavor the broth. So all that chopped cilantro goes in there, and then I always use a red bay leaf. Now I say red bay, these are off of my property. I might post a later video on that, but that's a local species. And then I like caraway seed. Here's where I'm really hybridizing the pho to kind of a fusion. I also like to do a little bit of some cloves. So I'm going to do a little bit of some ground cloves, just teeny little whisper. I think for this batch, I'm going to put some ground cardamom in there. I know this is usually associated with Indian food, but it'll really add a really nice balance to the flavor. I'm going to bring this to a simmer while I prepare the other ingredients. When I serve the pho, I like to have some fresh greens, so I've got some of the onion tops down in there, and I'm also pulling off some of the delicate leaves off this cilantro. That'll basically be garnish, but garnish that you can eat, and it'll really add to the appearance and the flavor and the freshness of this dish. And last but not least, I'm going to pull these basil leaves and the flower heads. Again, I eat the whole thing around here, but I'm going to take all of these basil leaves and flowers and flower heads off. I might use some of the flower heads for garnish, but basically pulling the leaves off, leaving the stems, and I'm going to add that to the broth and keep a few for dressing the final dish. And these are those basil leaves, and I can't begin to tell you how good this smells already. This is going to be so delicious tonight. The pho that I'm making is actually going to be pho ca, which is fish pho, and I've got sway fillets, which you can buy at the store, any grocery store now. It's basically a relative of the catfish. And what I'm doing is a dry rub that's made out of brown sugar, cayenne pepper, salt, garlic powder, onion powder, and whatever else you want. You can pick your favorite dry rub. I'm going to cook this fish separate from the pho and have it in the bowl when I pour the broth over it. To cook the fish, I'm just putting a healthy amount of olive oil in there, and I'm going to lay the fillets in there and kind of swirl it around and just cook it until it's flaky. maybe over medium-high heat, and I'll show you that as soon as it's cooked. All right, here's our fish. I've got it on medium-high, and it's been about 5 minutes on one side. I'm just gonna flip it once. And let it sit until we're ready to eat. Here are the rehydrated shiitake mushrooms, and I'm just gonna chunk them up into little slivers, bite-sized pieces. They've cooled down and they're nice and tender. And shiitake mushrooms basically have kind of an oniony, garlicky flavor by themselves, but it's the texture that really makes it stand out. The texture is sort of like a clam, like a cooked clam or an oyster. The stems are a little tougher. See how tough that is? But this will really add to the texture of the dish. All right, here go the shiitake all diced up, back into the broth. Keep this at a simmer while I finish the noodles and the fish. Also, because I have these snow peas from the garden tonight, I'm gonna throw in about a handful. I've removed the strings and the ends, and that'll just add a little bit to it. And you know what? What the heck? Why don't I throw in some of these Juliet cherry tomatoes from my greenhouse? That'll again add a little bit to the acidity and the sweetness. And you know, you can make pho however you want. Don't get restricted to recipes or what people think that you're supposed to make. It's basically for your enjoyment. It's really healthy, it's really fun. You just use whatever ingredients you got on hand, and it's all delicious, trust me. Guess I'm throwing in everything but the kitchen sink. I always use fresh garlic for pho. And one thing I learned is don't cook with the garlic. The volatiles will evaporate and you won't get that really intense garlic flavor. So what I do is I peel it, obviously, and then slice it. I slice it up really thinly, and I put it in the bottom of the bowl. And when the noodles and the fish and the broth go over that, it's all going to integrate together. And when you're drinking the broth and when you're hitting the bottom of the bowl, this garlic really punches you, and it's so much better than trying to cook with the garlic. Unfortunately, I don't have any fresh ginger for this, so I'm going to use sushi ginger. And you just need a couple slices in each bowl that you're serving. Again, I like to put it on the bottom with the garlic, and it just adds that nice little punch in the bottom of the broth. Finally, the noodles. What makes pho pho as opposed to ramen is that pho is rice flour noodles and ramen is wheat noodles. You can buy these rice noodles in different sizes, again at the Asian market, and they're wrapped in a little piece of bamboo. They only take about a minute in warm or hot water to soften up, and I just do it right in the broth and then serve it out in the bowl. You take that little bamboo string off, obviously. I've removed the fish that I cooked in this pan, and I ladled a little bit of that broth into here. And if you're into cooking, you know that what I'm doing is I'm deglazing. I'm taking all of that nice caramelized residue in a water solution, and I'm scraping it off the bottom of the pan, and I'm gonna add that reduction back into the dish. And now to serve the pho, I removed the bunch of noodles, and again, I've got to remove that little bamboo twist tie on there. And I've got 2 servings tonight. So first, I put the noodles, and then carefully, because this is really hot, you just basically untwist that little bamboo string, discard that. Then I put a piece of fish or 2 in each bowl. Now I'm gonna add some of that deglazed, nice caramelized bottom of the pan residue on top of that. And ladle some of the broth with all those veggies on top of that. This is piping hot. It's gonna be really, really, really delicious. And the very last thing is I garnish with a fresh lime slice on each side. And look at, I've got my little cilantro, I got the basil flowers, got a couple basil leaves, and I've got those little onion tops on there. Look at this. You could have this in a 5-star restaurant in Atlanta, LA, New York. I got some of the green onions on here. Just throw it all in. You can't have enough flavor. Here's the finished bowl of pho, and it looks beautiful, it tastes wonderful, it's light, it's filling at the same time. There's so many layers of flavor, and there's as many ways to eat pho as to cook it. I basically eat a lot of the big pieces with a fork, and I twirl the noodles just like spaghetti, into a spoon, and then use the spoon for the broth, and drink right out of the bowl at the end. So good. I can't even tell you guys how good that pho tastes.